Rice is one of the world's most important staple foods. With a rich cultivation history dating back thousands of years, it's become a staple for over half the world's population. In day-to-day life, I'm personally consuming rice multiple times a week, as it's a great, cheap source of good energy that best of all is super easy to store for long-term food storage. In this video, I'll cover everything you need to know for storing rice safely and securely for long-term food storage. By the end of this video, you'll learn why you might want to store rice, how much rice you should store per person per year, some different ways to store rice, and some tips on how to avoid pests coming up in your stored rice, along with some best practices on how to get the most shelf life out of your stored rice. We'll cover some methods on how you can store rice for up to 30 years for extreme long-term food storage. So let's get straight into it. Why you might want to store rice. Rice isn't just a staple food. It's one of the smartest items you can add to your food storage. Why? First, rice is affordable and versatile. By buying in bulk, you can save money up front, and you can also protect yourself from price increases down the road. Secondly, rice is calorie dense and extremely satiating. That means a relatively small amount can provide a lot of energy, something that's especially important in an emergency situation. I like storing rice amongst other grains to give myself peace of mind, whether it's a natural disaster, supply chain disruptions, or simply uncertain times. Knowing you have a reliable source of food on hand helps remove any stress. Finally, rice pairs well with almost anything. Beans, vegetables, meats and sauces, which makes it one of the easiest foods to turn into comforting meals, even when options are limited. How much rice you should store per person. Now, you might be wondering, how much rice should I store for long-term needs? On average, it's a good rule of thumb to stick to 1 pound of rice per person per week. So with that, it's recommended to store around 50 to 60 pounds of rice per person per year, which equivalates to around 22 to 27 kilos. Of course, this amount can vary depending on your own and family's diet and preferences. If rice is your main grain, like myself, you may want to store a little more. If you're also stocking up on other grains such as wheat, oats, or pasta, then you can plan for a little less rice overall. Although I personally like to store rice as it's one of the easiest and cheapest grains to store long term. Storing rice for long-term storage. Vacuum sealing is one of the most reliable and quickest ways to extend the shelf life of rice. By removing the air before sealing rice into strong airtight bags, vacuum sealing reduces oxidization, prevents insect infestations, and saves space in your pantry. It's especially useful if you want to create smaller, ready-to-use portions for everyday cooking, while still maintaining long-term freshness. I suggest sealing portions that will make the most sense in your own situation. Consider how many people you're going to feed for multiple meals to minimize the amount of bags used. This helps save money on bags. Once a vacuum seal has been broken, I like to try and use all the rice in less than a month to help maximize its freshness. I make sure when I am vacuum sealing rice, I am labeling the bags, the date I sealed it, along with how many grams are in the bag. I also like to make sure there is a proper seal and no visible signs of air getting in. If you like more tips on vacuum sealing, make sure to check out my other videos on vacuum sealing tips for beginners. I'll link to it in the comments below. Another way you can store rice for long-term storage is using Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers. Mylar bags are great because they block light, while oxygen absorbers remove the air that pests and bacteria need to survive. This is the method that they've done studies on where you can keep rice to 25 years if stored in a cool, dark area. Glass jars and food grade buckets are also popular options for storing rice. They provide a sturdy barrier against rodents and insects. When paired with oxygen absorbers, they offer excellent protection and make it easy to portion out smaller amounts of rice as needed. Okay, so to store this rice, I'm going to use the vacuum sealing method. So to do that, I'll obviously need my rice. I'll also need a vacuum sealer. This is an Anko branded vacuum sealer. I've done a few videos on how it works and some troubleshooting with it, so make sure to check those out. I'll also need some vacuum sealing bags. These are pre-made bags, hospitality supply warehouse. And I'll also need a Sharpie to label the bags of the date and stuff like that. Okay, I'll start by labeling my bags. Because I have 5 kilos, I'm going to divvy it up into around 500 gram lots. So I'll start by labeling all my bags. When I'm labeling, I like to do it along the top edge to make sure it's past where the vacuum sealer is going to make the seal. That way it's a nice flat surface, making it really easy to read, and it's very legible. Okay, now that all my bags are labeled, I'm going to put them to the side and I'm going to open up my rice and start measuring it out. Okay, so I'll open up this bag and I can start accessing the rice. Let me know where you're from and how much rice costs in your country. I typically like to store rice in bulk amounts as it just helps me save on the day-to-day costs of cooking. Okay, so I'll start by grabbing my bag, and I always like to peel back the top edge, which just makes it a lot easier to keep the bag open. I have a lot more tips on how to use vacuum sealers and some beginner tips if you're new to vacuum sealing, so make sure to check out my other videos. So I'll grab my cup and I'll just start putting the rice into all the separate bags. Now I like to keep the bags as flat as possible just so they're easy to store when it comes to putting them into my pantry. So you can also measure by using scales. So I'll go through and do this with the rest and I'll come back. Okay, so that's as many as I'm going to do for the time being, and I'll keep the remainder of that bag for immediate use. Now you don't have to make as big a mess as I have, but when storing rice you're almost guaranteed to get a few grains around the place. So now I'll just tidy up a bit and we'll get into storing. Okay, now that I've tidied up, let's start sealing. So like any vacuum sealing process, you'll want to make sure that the top edge of where you're sealing is free from any obstructions. This just helps allow all the air to escape freely. So I'm going to pat it down a little bit. I'll keep that top end inside the sealer. Make sure it's clicked on both sides. Your machine may be slightly different. And then I like to have it in dry, and I like to just use the vacuum seal function as this is an automatic mode that seems to get the job done. Okay, that's done. As you can see, when I labeled it, it made it really easy because it's above the seal, and just means it's not obstructed by anything that you're sealing. So that's a real nice tight seal, and all the oxygen has been successfully removed from that bag. Now you can opt to put oxygen absorber in this as well, but for my own personal needs and storage goals, I find it unnecessary. Let me know in the comments below what you'd like to store rice for, whether it's just to save a little bit on your grocery bill, or if you're looking to store it for a lot longer term, what other purposes you're storing rice for. So again, just keep the top seal nice and clean and free from obstructions on that heating element, and then just close it up and then run the process again. Okay, that's done. Again, just with each bag, make sure you're checking the seal and just for any signs that there's still oxygen inside there. This is the time you'll want to do it, because 2 or 3 years down the track, it's too late. So just make sure when you're sealing that the seal is nice and clean and there's no signs of oxygen in there. You can also opt to do a double seal if you're concerned, but I find this usually suffices. So I'll go through and do the rest of those. Okay, so there you have it. That's the last bag I'm doing. So now that I have my huge stack of vacuum sealed rice, this is gonna go into a cool, dry place in the bottom of my pantry. I wanna make sure it's inaccessible to any vermin, because rats can still chew into this, unfortunately. You can also choose to put this into like a hard bucket or plastic tub to just add an additional layer of protection from it. So right before I do that, I'm also just going to give them all a quick once over as I'm putting them away to make sure no oxygen has got into the bags during this time, and that's it. So this is my preferred method for storing rice, as it's typically cheaper than using Mylar bags. They can tend to be a little bit more expensive, but they are also a great alternative as they reduce the amount of light that gets into whatever you're storing. I will do a comparison video between the two on my channel coming up, so make sure to subscribe to see when that comes out. How long does rice store for? In ideal conditions, you can store vacuum sealed rice for up to 30 years. Now 30 years is a crazy long time, and I personally haven't stored it for 30 years myself, but there's been some great studies done by the Utah State University storing white rice. I'll link to it in the description below on the tests they done where they reference using oxygen absorbers in the cool storage area. But in my personal application, I'm typically aiming to store rice for around 2 to 5 years, as I'd like to rotate my stored foods often, although I'm sure it would last much longer if I needed it to. Storage temperature. For best results, grains like rice should be kept at around 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below. But even at a steady 70 degrees Fahrenheit, around 21 degrees, rice stored with oxygen absorbers will last up to 10 years with no issues. In cooler environments where rice is sealed in oxygen-free containers, it can last as long as 30 years. So with the right packaging and conditions, rice can be a reliable food storage staple that can last for decades. Let me know where you're from around the world and how much rice costs in your area, as I'm super interested to compare. If you found this video helpful, make sure to leave a like. If you have any questions about storing rice, make sure to leave them in the comments below and I'll try and answer them as soon as possible.